Chapter 4. Completely Dead. Martha was red-haired, freckled, and oblivious to the fact that within the last year she had grown tall, slender, and curvy. Very curvy. The realization was to come in time, about the time that the freckles, with considerable prompting from Martha, started to disappear. But for the moment she preferred blue serge bloomers to skirts, midi blouses to sweaters, and bicycles to rumble seats. Martha was casual, easygoing, steady, and a favorite with everybody. Efficiency came to her naturally, partly because of her temperament, partly because she was at the age when the mere mention of work had a depressing effect. If possible, work was to be avoided altogether. If not, it was to be disposed of as rapidly as possible, and with a minimum of fatigue, hence efficiency. She had just finished her sophomore year in high school, during which she had broken Anne and Ernestine's previous records by carrying home her own books less than a dozen times. She accepted her mail carriers matter-of-factly, without attributing their attention to anything going on under her very nose. Our house was almost 2 miles from Montclair High School, and Anne and Ernestine used to say that Martha selected her gentleman friends solely on their ability to carry heavy weights for long distances. We recovered from chicken pox in a comparatively short time, and Martha took over the job of supervising the packing for Nantucket. She had Frank and Bill bring 3 trunks from the attic to the upstairs hall. We carried our clothes to her, and she made sure we had everything we needed before she let us put them in the trunks. Martha herself was established in a very comfortable chair and didn't have to move. To simplify the matter of logistics, Martha had drawn up a number of check-off lists, from which she seemed to derive more than her share of satisfaction. Martha was usually on the receiving end of orders from Anne and Ernestine, and it was a special pleasure for her to have an opportunity to boss them now. "Name," she began by asking Anne when Anne appeared in the hall with a pile of her own clothes. "Speak out loudly so I can hear you." "My cow," Anne replied. "It's all right to be efficient, but don't carry it too far." "Do you," said Martha, offering to hand her the check-off list, "want to supervise the packing?" Anne admitted she didn't. "Then be good enough, please, just to answer a few simple questions." "Name?" "Pavio Normai, the Flying Fin," Anne told her. "Age 18. Hobbies: taking orders and impudence from a mere slip of a girl." "Speak out loudly so I can hear you," Martha said, thumbing through her papers and coming up with Anne's check-off sheet. "Oh, what's the use?" Anne snorted, and then, shouting, answered, "Anne!" "Good," Martha beamed. "Dresses?" 6. Martha made a note of it. "Bathing suit?" "Sure does. Mr. Bones' suit fits just fine." "Speak out loudly so I can hear you." 1, Anne hollered. "You're so efficient I'll bet you rock the world, rocking with the grain of the wood." After running through the complete list, all the way from hairpins to shoe trees, Martha directed Anne where to stow her clothes. Then the rest of us, by age, stepped up, gave our name, and went through the same routine. Each older child, besides being responsible for himself, was responsible for a younger child. Anne was responsible for Jane, Ernestine for Jack, Martha for Bob, and Frank for Dan. This applied not only to packing clothes, but any family project or an emergency. In the event of fire, or when crossing a street, or when coming to writing up the daily jobs on the process charts, the older ones were supposed to help their particular charges. Bill, Lillian, and Fred were in the intermediate group, old enough to look out for themselves, but not old enough to help anyone else. Once the clothes were packed, together with the sheets, blankets, tools, dolls, games, scrapbooks, crystal detectors, and headphones, stamp collections, free samples, and other articles that couldn't possibly be left behind, we devoted our attention to departure day. Martha, meanwhile, had taken over the budget. Martha was not ungenerous with her own money, although it didn't exactly flow through her fingers. But when it came to handling Mother's money, her fingers had to be pried apart and twisted. It was a waste of time to tell Martha you couldn't take it with you. She had long since made up her mind that, if that were the case, no sensible person would ever dream of going. She drew up acquisition slips that we had to fill out in triplicate to buy anything for the house or to get our weekly allowances. We agreed with Bill that it seemed a lot of trouble to go to for 15 cents a week. To get to Nantucket, we plan to take a Lackawanna train from Montclair to Hoboken, a ferry from Hoboken to New York, a night boat from New York to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the Nantucket boat from New Bedford to our destination. We knew that all those transferring with our suitcases and the younger children was going to be a job, but the trip on the night boat was cheaper than going to New Bedford by train. Martha, who had been duly identified by Anne at the bank, cashed a check and went to New York to pick up the reservations. She was appalled and unnerved when the man at the ticket office on the dock told her the total cost. There must be some mistake, she told him. It's Nantucket we're going to, not Paris, France. Will you mind adding it up again? The man added again, and then Martha checked him, twice. When she finally became convinced there was no mistake, she decided to turn back 2 of the 5 staterooms Mother had reserved, and to exchange 2 of the full fare tickets for half fares. When she returned from the city, Martha, bristling with indignation, told Ernestine and Anne about the prices. She also explained about turning in the staterooms and exchanging the tickets. So I saved better than $20, she concluded. There'll have to be 4 of us in each of the 2 staterooms and 3 of the other. Good night, said Anne. Even 3 persons in one of the staterooms is a slum, but I guess we'll manage somehow. Of course we will, Martha agreed. And think of saving. Wait a minute, Anne interrupted. You have forgotten all about Tom. Where is he going to sleep? And if you try telling us he's going to sleep in one of our staterooms, Ernestine put in, all I can say is that that's carrying economy a little too far. It certainly is, Anne agreed. The very idea. I'll scrub floors, Ernestine announced dramatically. I'll clean out the restrooms and the Hudson tubes, but I will... Neither will I, said Anne. I didn't forget about him, Martha insisted. And for cat's sake, put down the scrub brushes and get off your hands and knees. Where's he going to sleep then? Anne asked. Well, said Martha, he was complaining just the other day about how he never slept a wink on the way to Nantucket. So if he doesn't sleep anyway, what's the use of throwing away perfectly good money? You can't do that to him, Anne protested. You go right back to New York and get another stateroom. It's all right, Martha insisted. I already told him about it. Poor Tom, Anne sympathized. What did he say? Oh, you know Tom. He grumbled about 120 million people in the country and about how Lincoln freed all the slaves but one, but he didn't really object. Poor Tom, Anne repeated. My cow. I don't know why he puts up with this, Ernestine agreed. Look, said Martha, fishing angrily in her pocket for the checkbook. Do either of you want to take over the budget? I ask you, do you? I guess it wasn't such a bad idea after all, Anne hastily assured her. And you did, Ernestine pointed out, save more than $20 of Mother's money. Perfectly good money, amended Martha, who obviously considered all currency of the realm to be eminently satisfactory. And I wouldn't have done it if he hadn't said he didn't sleep. It's all right, I guess, said Anne, but how about those 2 half fares? What about that? Martha demanded belligerently, fishing for the checkbook again. Put that thing away, Anne told her. I'm in charge here, and I'm not going to have checkbook, check-off sheets, manifests, or bills of lading waved in my face every time I open my mouth. Frank might possibly be able to get away with a half fare, but not you, Ernestine said. I'd like to know why not, Martha replied indignantly. I'm a little tall, I admit, but I certainly can bend my knees when I go up the gangplank. Well, it's not just being tall, Ernestine said significantly. Well, what is it then? For goodness sake, said Anne, looking. Just look at yourself. Martha glanced down and shrugged. Oh, that, she said. My gosh, nobody pays any attention to things like that. Our train for Hoboken left in the early afternoon. We didn't want to have to pay for more than 1 taxi cab, so 5 of the older children, with Ernestine in charge, walked from the house to the station. Anne and Tom, with all the 5 youngest children and all of our suitcases, waited at the house for a taxi. The suitcases were lined up on the front steps, and Anne had the 5 children washed and ready when the cab finally appeared. It wasn't until the suitcases were stowed away and the children packed into the taxi that Anne discovered Tom was missing. She called him, but he didn't answer. She unlocked the front door and searched the house. In the kitchen she found Tom's cap, a cage with our 2 canaries, and an empty cardboard box with holes punched in the top, but no Tom. The cab driver kept blowing his horn, and Anne went out front to pacify him. The children were jumping and crawling around the car, and Bob was sitting in the driver's lap. "If you're the ringmaster," the driver told Anne, reaching into the back seat and rescuing his hat from Jack, "you better get the show on the road. I've got other stops to make this afternoon, you know." "I'm doing the best I can," Anne said. "We'll be ready in a minute. I think our cookie's looking for his cat." "How about Mr. Chairman?" Fred asked. Anne snapped her fingers. "I know I forgot something. Where is he?" "Mr. Chairman was our dog, a sort of collie. He was there, barking at the cab and growling at the driver." "Get a leash on him," Anne told Fred. "Don't let him get away." Tom came running down Eagle Rock Way. 14, he panted. "Ain't nowhere to be found." "We'll have to leave her," Anne said. "We're late for the train right now. Get in the cab quickly." "Leave 14?" Tom asked incredulously. "Are you crazy?" "Please, we simply must catch the train." "What do you think I am?" Tom snapped. "I'm not going to leave that cat. If she don't go, I don't go." "We've got Mr. Chairman," Anne begged, "and you've got the canaries." "But I ain't got 14. "Damn it," Anne shouted. "I planned this trip for better than 2 weeks. I planned it right down to the last bath and shine shoe. A plague of chicken pox didn't delay it, and no cat's going to ruin it. Now get into the cab." Tom never heard Anne swear before, and he was impressed. "I haven't got my cap," he said. "Neither the birds." "Get them," Anne told him, "and be damn quick about it." "You heard what the lady said," the driver put in. "I got other stops to make." Tom went, mumbling but hurrying. "I wished your father could hear you talk like that. He'd learn you good, you bold thing." Tom was still mumbling when he returned in a juggling half-run with his cap in the cage and got into the cab. "He'd learn you all right, swearing like a cab driver in front of all them children. And you ain't no too big to spank, neither." Anne locked the front door and jumped into the cab. 1 cab for 7 people, 8 suitcases, a dog, and 2 canaries. The driver inventoried as we started down the driveway. "You should have ordered 3 at least." "We're not too crowded," Anne said as cheerfully as she could. "Is that dog housebroken?" "Usually," Anne lied. "I don't think my insurance covers this." "It probably does," she laughed weakly. "You have an act of God clause." A block from the house we saw 14. The cab stopped. Tom called, and there was a streak of orange as the cat dived into his lap and then perched on his shoulder. "Look at that," Tom crowed, all his complaints forgotten. "She was waiting on us. Smartest cat I ever seen, bar none." Are there any other passengers or livestock we're supposed to be picking up?" the driver asked. "No," Anne told him sheepishly. "No cows, goats, or other children?" "No." "Are you sure we got them all?" "Yes. And may one inquire where the destination is at?" "Oh, excuse me," said Anne. "The Lackawanna station." "I thought maybe it was Overbrook, you know, the funny farm." "No," Anne said meekly. "The Lackawanna station, please." She leaned back in the seat and tried to adjust Jane a little more comfortably on her lap. She closed her eyes and thought of Mother, now safe in England. She thought of previous trips when we had driven to New Bedford and taken the Nantucket boat from there. She thought of Dad, strong, gay, and dependable, sitting behind the wheel of our old Pierce Arrow, blowing his bulb horn and shouting, "Road hog!" at the drivers who swerved for their lives as we went barreling by in a cloud of smoke. From Anne's standpoint, at least, the remainder of the trip to Nantucket had only about half the earmarks of a howling success. The howling half. The hubbub of the night boat dock demoralized Mr. Chairman, and he yapped, howled, and had to be dragged stiff-legged along the dock to the gangplank. Every 2 or 3 steps Frank would stop and bat him, trying to keep him quiet, but the wallops made Mr. Chairman yap and howl all the louder. Tom, with 14 in the birdcage under one arm and a bulging wicker suitcase under the other, kept shouting threats about how he'd dose that dog good if he didn't shut up. Each of the older children held the hand of his particular younger charge and carried a suitcase. Martha discouraged eager porters who came running to meet us by telling them we were too poor to afford them. By the time we single-filed up the gangplank, which Martha negotiated almost on her knees, the rails were lined with grinning spectators. Anne and Ernestine looked straight ahead, pretending not to notice, but the rest of us waved and grinned back. "Carry your bags?" said a porter who was coming down the gangplank from the ship. "No," shouted Frank, who sometimes read college humor. "Let them walk." That was a sort of joke that appealed to Frank, and he laughed deafeningly through his nose as always. "Hink, hink, 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 hink," he cackled. "That's a hot one." The pursuer was so engrossed by our entrance, he made no pretense of checking to see whether we had full fare tickets. He did insist, though, that Mr. Chairman and 14 be checked with the freight down in the hold. All through the night you could hear Mr. Chairman complaining about that. We were allowed to keep the birds, and they ended up in Anne's stateroom, where she shared the lower berth with Jane, while Fred and Dan shared the upper. Anne wouldn't let either Jane or Dan drink any liquids after 6 o'clock, but the inevitable happened anyway. It wasn't until the following morning, when we had transferred to New Bedford to the new Nantucket boat, that Anne discovered Morton Dykes. Morton was an Amherst man and a sheik whom Anne rated high on her hit caravan. He was very tall, 6 feet 7 or 8, and thin, but quite good-looking in his patent leather hair and Oxford bags. He and Anne had had a good many dates that spring while she was at Smith. We often heard her talk about him, but we had never seen him before. It wasn't necessary to check animals with the freight on the Nantucket boat, and Morton bumped into Anne on the upper deck, where all of us, including the birds, dog, and cat, were gathered. Bumping is the word, because it soon became apparent that as far as Morton was concerned, the meeting was not only unpremeditated and unrehearsed, but undesired. "For goodness sakes," said Anne, trying to straighten out her dress, which had been rumpled beyond repair by Jane. "Look who's here. Hello, Morton." "Hello," said Morton, almost whispering, edging away as if Anne had something he didn't want to catch. "Good to see you." "Good to see you, too," said Anne enthusiastically. When Anne was enthused, her voice had all the modulation of a cheerleader's in the last minute of the final quarter. Morton edged still farther away. "I knew you and your mother were coming to Nantucket," she added, "but I had no idea we'd be on the same boat." "We were on the night boat with you, too," Morton reported resentfully. "We saw you come aboard." "Oh, you did," was all Anne could manage. "Was that your dog that howled all night?" "I didn't hear anything," Anne said. Morton edged some more, and Anne finally realized he didn't want to be mistaken for one of our group. The realization made her furious. "Come on over," she said. "Meet everybody. Pull up a chair and make yourself at home." "No, thanks, I gotta run." "Why don't you bring your mother up here and we'll all sit together?" This suggestion caused Morton to drop all pretense of edging and to break into an open retreat. "See you around," he whispered over his shoulder. "Or," Anne hollered after him, "we could all come and sit with you." Morton disappeared down a ladder to the lower decks. "So that's Morton Dykes," Ernestine said. "Gee, he's cute, and so tall. The least you could have done was introduce me." "I tried," Anne told her bitterly. "You heard me try." "Ah, the whole boat heard you," Martha said. "If you ask me, he's a beanpole and a wet smack." "You're just judging him as potential book carrier," Ernestine grinned. "You know that those tall, thin ones get tired easily." "He seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere," Martha said. "Does he always edge away like that, like a crab?" "He was ashamed of us," said Anne. "Well, any feeling I may have had for him in the past is dead. Completely dead." "Why would anyone be ashamed of us?" Bill wanted to know. "You girls are crazy." He looked like he had heard about our chicken pox, and he hadn't had them. "Martha's right," Ernestine agreed. "He's a wet smack." "Dead," Anne repeated dramatically. "Completely dead."